Jason Cole pulled his torn blanket tighter around his shoulders as the winter wind cut through the alley like a frozen blade. The cardboard box he called home did little to keep out the cold of Neo-Chicago's brutal December nights. His stomach growled, reminding him that the half-eaten sandwich he'd found in a dumpster yesterday was his last meal. At 32 years old, Jason had been living on the streets for 4 years, ever since the factory closed and took his job, his savings, and eventually his apartment. Nobody looked at homeless people anymore. They were invisible, forgotten, just part of the urban landscape like graffiti on walls. Tonight felt different, though. The air seemed to hum with strange energy, and Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. He was right. The sky above Neo-Chicago suddenly blazed with light. Massive ships descended through the clouds, their hulls gleaming like polished silver and studded with lights that pulsed in mesmerizing patterns. Jason scrambled out of his cardboard shelter, staring upward with his mouth open. All around him, people poured into the streets, pointing and shouting. Some screamed in fear, others pulled out their phones to record the impossible sight. Their vessels were enormous, each one larger than several city blocks combined. The royal announcement. Within minutes, every screen in the city flickered to life. Billboards, phones, tablets, even the old television in the electronics store window all showed the same image. An alien being appeared, tall and elegant, with skin that shimmered like mother of pearl. Its features were humanoid, but refined to an otherworldly perfection. Large, almond-shaped eyes, the color of liquid gold, gazed out from the screens with ancient wisdom. When it spoke, the voice seemed to bypass Jason's ears entirely and speak directly into his mind, clear and melodious. The being introduced itself as Ambassador Theron of the Galactic Unity Council. Jason listened, transfixed, as Theron explained that humanity was about to learn a truth that had been hidden for millions of years. Long before humans had built their first civilizations, before they had even discovered fire, another species had ruled this sector of the galaxy. They were called the Celestial Monarchs, beings of incredible power and wisdom, who had established an empire spanning thousands of worlds. The Celestial Monarchs possessed abilities that seemed like magic to lesser species. They could manipulate energy with their thoughts, heal with a touch, and see into the fabric of reality itself. They had seeded life on countless planets, including Earth, and had left their genetic legacy scattered across the stars before mysteriously vanishing 3 million years ago. Ambassador Theron continued with news that sent shockwaves through every nation on Earth. The Galactic Unity Council had been searching for descendants of the Celestial Monarchs for centuries. Their scanners had detected a powerful royal signature emanating from Earth, a bloodline so pure that it shouldn't exist after millions of years of genetic dilution. Somewhere on this planet lived someone who carried the royal DNA in almost perfect concentration. That person was destined to inherit the power, knowledge, and position of the ancient Celestial Monarchs. The Council was initiating a mandatory global scan. Every human would be tested. The heir would be found. The testing begins. Within 48 hours, testing stations materialized in every major city on Earth. They were beautiful structures of crystalline material that seemed to grow from the ground overnight, spiraling upward in elegant towers that hummed with soft energy. Aliens of various species staffed the stations, processing thousands of humans per hour. The procedure was simple and painless. Step into a booth, place your hand on a glowing panel, wait 10 seconds for the scan to complete. If you weren't the royal heir, you received a credit chip worth 1,000 Earth dollars as compensation for your time. If you were the heir, well, the reward was beyond imagination. People lined up by the thousands, driven by curiosity, greed, and hope. Everyone dreamed of being the chosen one. Social media exploded with posts from people declaring they felt special, that they'd always known they were different. News channels ran nonstop coverage, interviewing genetics experts and historians. World leaders called for calm, while secretly hoping the heir would be from their nation. Jason watched the chaos from his alley with detached amusement. He had no intention of getting tested. What did ancient aliens and royal bloodlines matter to a homeless man whose biggest concern was finding his next meal? Besides, there was no way someone like him,
invisible and worthless in society's eyes, could be anything special.
But the scanning was truly mandatory. On the third day, enforcement drones began sweeping through the cities, identifying every person who hadn't been tested yet. The drones were sleek, floating spheres that moved with silent grace, their sensors able to detect and identify any human within range. One found Jason on the morning of the fourth day. He was trying to warm his hands over a small fire he'd made in a metal barrel when the drone descended from the sky, its surface reflecting his gaunt face back at him. A pleasant gender-neutral voice emanated from the device, informing Jason that he was required to report to the nearest testing station immediately. Jason tried to explain that there was no point, that he was nobody, that they were wasting their time. The drone simply repeated its message and began to slowly escort him toward the station, its sensors tracking his every movement. The walk through the city streets was humiliating. Jason was acutely aware of how he must look and smell. His clothes were filthy and torn, his hair matted, his beard unkempt. People on the clean sidewalks gave him disgusted looks and moved away, some covering their noses. Children pointed and parents pulled them closer. Jason was used to the stares, but it never stopped hurting. The testing station loomed ahead, a beautiful tower of light and crystal that made him feel even more out of place. The drone guided him to an entrance where an alien attendant, a being with blue skin and 3 eyes arranged in a triangle, gestured for him to enter. Inside, the station was immaculate. Soft light illuminated white floors so clean they reflected like mirrors. The air smelled faintly of something pleasant Jason couldn't identify. Aliens of various species move efficiently through the space, directing human traffic with practiced ease. The moment everything changed, Jason was directed to booth 17. The interior was cylindrical and just large enough for one person. The scanner was a flat panel embedded in the wall, glowing with a gentle blue light. An alien technician, this one resembling a tall insect with multifaceted eyes, explained in perfect English that Jason should place his palm flat on the scanner and hold it there until the light turned green. Simple procedure, done thousands of times already today. Jason stepped forward and placed his hand on the panel. The blue light intensified, washing over him in rhythmic wave. He felt a strange tingling sensation, like gentle electricity dancing across his skin. It wasn't unpleasant, just unusual. He waited for the light to turn green so he could collect his $1,000 chip and leave. Instead, the scanner began to emit a sound Jason had never heard before. It started as a low hum, then rose rapidly in pitch and volume, becoming a piercing tone that made everyone in the facility stop and turn. The blue light exploded into brilliant gold, so bright that Jason had to close his eyes. The panel beneath his hand grew hot, almost burning. He tried to pull away, but his hand seemed fused to the scanner, held by an invisible force. Alarms blared throughout the building. The walls of the booth began to shake. Through his closed eyelids, Jason could see the golden light growing even brighter, pulsing in waves that seemed to resonate with his heartbeat. Then, with a sound like breaking glass, the booth's door flew open, and Jason was surrounded by dozens of aliens, all shouting in languages he didn't understand. The insect-like technician was staring at him with what might have been shock or awe, its mandibles clicking rapidly. Other aliens pushed forward with handheld devices, scanning him from every angle. Their instruments sparked and flickered, overwhelmed by whatever they were detecting. Ambassador Farron himself materialized in the crowd, his elegant form seeming to glide rather than walk. When he spoke, his mental voice carried a weight of disbelief and wonder that silenced everyone else. The ambassador said they had found him. Against all probability, against every statistical model they had created, the heir to the celestial monarchs stood before them. Jason Cole, homeless and forgotten, invisible to the society that had abandoned him, carried within his cells the purest concentration of royal DNA ever recorded, 99.7%.
It shouldn't be possible. Genetic drift over 3 million years should have reduced any remaining royal markers to trace amounts. Yet here stood a man whose DNA was nearly identical to the ancient celestial monarchs themselves.
Jason tried to speak, to explain that there had been a mistake, but his voice came out as a croak. An alien attendant rushed forward with water in a container made of something that looked like living crystal. Jason drank gratefully, his hands shaking. Ambassador Theron knelt before him, an act of respect that seemed to shock the other aliens present. The ambassador explained gently that there was no mistake. The scanners were incapable of error. The royal bloodline the Galactic Unity Council had been seeking for centuries had survived, hidden in plain sight, in a man that Earth's own society had deemed worthless. Jason's mind reeled. Hours ago, his biggest problem had been finding a warm place to sleep. Now he was being told he was the genetic heir to an empire that had ruled the galaxy millions of years ago. It was insane. It was impossible. But the scanner didn't lie, and the way every alien in the room looked at him with awe and reverence and barely concealed excitement told him this was terrifyingly real. Dr. Myra, a tall alien with luminescent purple skin and large, kind eyes, stepped forward and introduced herself as the Council's chief royal geneticist. She had spent 200 years studying the celestial monarchs and their legacy. She explained that what Jason carried in his DNA was more than just genetic information. The celestial monarchs had encoded abilities directly into their bloodline, powers that could be awakened with proper training and guidance. Jason might be able to manipulate matter and energy, heal injuries, enhance his physical capabilities far beyond normal human limits, even access something called the royal consciousness, a psychic network that had once connected all celestial monarchs across vast distances. Ambassador Theron stood and addressed Jason formally. The council could not and would not force him to do anything. The choice was entirely his. But they hoped he would agree to come with them, to travel to the Unity Nexus, the Council's central hub, where he could be properly educated about his heritage and trained to access his abilities. They could offer him protection, resources, and the opportunity to understand what he truly was. But Theron also warned him honestly. Jason's life would never be the same. News of his discovery would spread through the galactic community like wildfire. There would be factions that wanted to study him, groups that would seek to control him, and even some who might see him as a threat to their power. The Unity Council could offer protection and guidance, but ultimately Jason had to decide whether he wanted to embrace this destiny or reject it. A choice to make. Jason sat in stunned silence, his mind trying to process the impossible situation. Part of him wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Yesterday, he'd been digging through trash for food, and today, he was being offered a position as the heir to an ancient galactic empire. But another part of him, a part he'd thought had died years ago when he lost everything, stirred with something that felt like hope. What did he have on Earth? No family that cared about him. His parents were long dead, and his sister had stopped returning his calls years ago. No friends, no home, no future. Just more cold nights in cardboard boxes, more hunger, more invisibility. The streets would kill him eventually, whether from exposure, malnutrition, or violence. He had nothing to lose. But more than that, something deep inside him resonated with the scanner's golden light. For the first time in years, Jason felt like maybe he was something more than garbage, more than a burden on society. Maybe there was a reason he'd survived when so many others hadn't. Jason looked up at Ambassador Theron, and in a voice steadier than he felt, said he would go with them. The ambassador's relief was visible even across the alien features. Theron immediately began speaking into a small device, issuing orders in a musical language that flowed like water. Within minutes, Jason was being ushered out of the testing station through a private exit, away from the crowds and cameras that had already started to gather outside. A sleek vehicle that hovered silently above the ground was waiting. Jason had never been in any vehicle this nice. The interior was comfortable, with seats that seemed to mold themselves to his body. And the ride was so smooth,
He could barely tell they were moving. They drove through Neo-Chicago toward a landing pad where a shuttlecraft waited, its hull gleaming in the afternoon sun.
The shuttle was unlike anything Jason had imagined. The interior was spacious and elegant, with seats arranged in a circle around a central holographic display. The walls seemed to be made of a material that was solid, but somehow also transparent, offering views of the outside world. As Jason strapped himself into a seat, with help from an attendant, he noticed other passengers boarding. These were aliens of various species, all members of Ambassador Theron's diplomatic team returning to the Unity Nexus. Some were humanoid, others decidedly not, but all regarded Jason with curious and respectful gazes. The shuttle lifted off with barely a vibration, rising smoothly into the sky. Jason pressed his face to the transparent wall, watching Neo-Chicago shrink below him. The city spread out in a grid of lights and steel, and for the first time, he could see how vast it truly was. Higher and higher they climbed, passing through clouds that looked like cotton from above. Then the sky darkened from blue to black, and stars appeared, brighter and more numerous than Jason had ever seen from the light-polluted streets. The earth curved away below them, a blue and white marble suspended in the infinite darkness of space. Jason felt tears streaming down his face. He had never been more than 50 miles from where he was born, and now he was leaving the planet entirely. An alien sitting beside him, a being with silver skin and no visible mouth, somehow conveyed sympathy through its large eyes. It offered Jason a cloth to wipe his tears, a gesture of kindness that transcended language and species. Above Earth, the Unity fleet waited. Dozens of ships hung in orbit, ranging from small scout craft to massive vessels that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built. The largest ship was called the Celestial Throne, Ambassador Theron's flagship. It was 5 miles long, its hull covered in intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. Lights shone from thousands of windows, and smaller craft moved around it like fish around a whale. The shuttle approached a docking bay that looked large enough to hold several city blocks. Welcome to a new world. As the shuttle settled onto the docking platform with barely a bump, Jason felt his heart racing. When the door opened, he stepped out onto the deck of an alien starship, officially leaving behind everything he had ever known. The docking bay was a hive of activity. Aliens of every conceivable shape and size moved through the space, loading cargo, performing maintenance, and going about their duties. Some walked on 2 legs like humans, others on 4 or more. Some had wings, others tentacles. The diversity was overwhelming and magnificent. Ambassador Theron led Jason through corridors that were clearly designed to accommodate multiple species. Doorways adjusted their height automatically as different beings passed through. The gravity felt normal to Jason, but he noticed aliens wearing special harnesses that presumably adjusted the gravitational field to their preferences. The walls displayed information in writing that seemed to change based on who was looking at it, automatically translating into whatever language the viewer could understand. They arrived at what Theron called the Royal Medical Bay, though it looked more like a combination of advanced laboratory and sacred temple. The chamber was vast, with ceilings that stretched up into shadow. The walls were lined with equipment that hummed with soft energy, and at the center stood a platform surrounded by floating holographic displays, showing complex diagrams that Jason couldn't begin to understand. Dr. Myra was waiting for them, along with a team of specialists from various species. She greeted Jason warmly and explained that they needed to perform detailed scans to understand the full extent of his genetic heritage. She promised it wouldn't hurt, that they simply needed comprehensive data to properly guide his training. Jason agreed nervously and allowed himself to be led to the central platform. The scanning process was unlike anything Jason had experienced. He stood in the center of the platform while dozens of instruments orbited around him, projecting beams of colored light that passed through his body. Some felt range, others cold, but none were painful. Dr. Myra and her team watched displays that filled with scrolling data, occasionally conferring in hushed tones and pointing at particularly interesting readings. The scan lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, Jason was exhausted from standing still for so long, but the scientists were practically vibrating with excitement. Dr. Myra pulled up a holographic display of Jason's DNA structure. Even to Jason's untrained eye, he could see patterns that glowed with golden light, woven throughout the double helix like threads of precious metal. Dr. Myra explained the findings with barely contained enthusiasm. Jason's royal markers weren't just present, they were active and expressing themselves throughout his body. Normally, such ancient genetic code would be dormant, requiring specific triggers or extensive training to awaken. But in Jason, they were already functioning, providing benefits he had probably never noticed. She asked if he'd ever experienced anything unusual. Moments where he'd survived situations that should have killed him. Times when he'd known things he had no way of knowing. Or instances where his body had healed faster than normal. Jason thought carefully about his years on the streets. Now that she mentioned it, there had been things. He'd once fallen from a fire escape, a 20-foot drop that should have broken bones, but he'd walked away with just bruises. There was a brutal winter when the temperature dropped to -20, and 3 other homeless people in his area had frozen to death. But Jason had somehow survived the night. Once, he'd known to move away from a spot on the sidewalk seconds before a brick fell from a construction site above. A brick that would have killed him. Dr. Myra nodded as if these stories confirmed her theories. She explained that celestial monarchs had what she called a baseline enhancement to all physical and mental capabilities. Their bodies were more resilient, their minds more perceptive, their reflexes faster. But the real power lay in their ability to interface directly with what she called the universal energy field, the fundamental force that connected all matter and energy in the universe. Celestial monarchs could perceive this field, manipulate it, and draw power from it. Jason had been doing this unconsciously his entire life, using abilities he didn't know he had to survive impossible situations. Now that they understood what he was, they could teach him to use these abilities consciously and deliberately. But it would take time, training, and a willingness to push beyond everything he thought was possible. The shadow threat. Jason was about to ask what kind of training she meant when alarms suddenly blared throughout the ship. Ambassador Theron's expression shifted from calm to urgent as he listened to something through a communication device. He turned to Jason with concern in his golden eyes. The ambassador explained that they had a problem. The scan results had been automatically transmitted to the Unity Council's central database, and from there, the information had leaked into the broader Galactic network. Now everyone knew that the royal heir had been found, and not everyone was happy about it. A faction called the Shadow Collective had just broadcast a message to the Unity fleet. They were a militant organization that believed the celestial monarchs had been tyrants who had suppressed other species, and they saw any heir to that legacy as a threat. They were demanding that Jason be handed over to them for what they called justice, but what was really execution. If the Unity Council refused, the Shadow Collective would consider it an act of war. Theron's voice was firm as he explained that the Council had obviously rejected the demand. They would not surrender a sentient being to be murdered, regardless of the threats. But this meant Jason was now at the center of a potential conflict. The Shadow Collective had a reputation for violence and had resources that made them dangerous. The Unity Council could provide protection, but Jason needed to be prepared for the possibility that he might have to defend himself. Dr. Myra stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Jason's shoulder. She said they needed to accelerate his training. Under normal circumstances, awakening royal abilities was a gradual process, taking months or even years. But they didn't have that luxury. She believed that with proper guidance and the right techniques, Jason could access basic abilities within days. It would be intense and possibly dangerous, but it was necessary. The training began immediately. Dr. Myra took Jason to a special chamber deep within the celestial throne. The room was spherical, about 30 feet in diameter, with walls that seemed to be made of flowing silver liquid. The floor beneath Jason's feet felt solid, but also somehow alive, responding to his presence with gentle pulses of light. Dr. Myra explained that this was an amplification chamber, designed to enhance the natural energy field that celestial monarchs could perceive. For Jason, it would make his latent senses easier to detect and use, like turning up the volume on music that had been playing too quietly to hear. She guided him through breathing exercises first, teaching him to relax and focus his awareness inward. It was harder than it sounded. Jason's mind kept racing with thoughts about everything that had happened. the threats from the Shadow Collective, the impossibility of his situation. But Dr. Myra's voice was patient and calming, guiding him back to focus each time his concentration wandered. Gradually, Jason began to notice something. At first, it was just a sensation, like a vibration at the edge of perception. But as he relaxed deeper into the meditation, the sensation became clearer. He could feel energy flowing through the chamber, through his own body, connecting everything in a vast web of invisible threads. Dr. Myra's excited voice broke through his concentration. She told him he was perceiving the universal energy field for the first time consciously. Those threads, he felt, were connections between all matter and energy, the underlying structure of reality itself. Celestial monarchs could see these threads, could reach out and touch them, and by doing so could cause effects in the physical world. She wanted Jason to try something simple. There was a small crystal sphere floating in the center of a chamber, suspended by magnetic fields. Dr. Myra asked Jason to reach out with his mind, not his hand, and touch the energy threads connected to the sphere, then try to move it. Jason opened his eyes and stared at the sphere. It was about the size of a baseball, glowing faintly with internal light. He could see threads of energy connecting it to the chamber walls, to the floor, to him. He focused on one of the threads, imagining his consciousness reaching out like a hand. Nothing happened. He tried again, pushing harder with his will. Still nothing. Frustration built inside him. Dr. Myra gently reminded him that force wasn't the answer. The celestial monarchs didn't command the energy field, they harmonized with it. Jason needed to ask, not demand. He took a deep breath and tried a different approach. Instead of pushing, he simply touched one of the threads with his awareness and suggested that the sphere might move. Just a gentle request sent through the energy field. The sphere trembled. It was just a tiny motion, barely perceptible, but it moved. Jason's eyes widened in shock, and the sphere immediately stopped. Dr. Myra was smiling, her purple skin glowing brighter with excitement. That was excellent for a first attempt, she said. With practice, Jason would be able to move objects effortlessly, eventually manipulating matter at the molecular level. Battle training. The training continued for days, increasing in intensity and complexity. Jason learned to sense the energy fields of living beings, to distinguish between different types of energy, and to begin manipulating his own body's energy to enhance his physical capabilities. He found he could make himself stronger, faster, more resilient by channeling energy from the universal field into his muscles and bones. One day, Dr. Myra had him demonstrate on a punching bag. Without enhancement, Jason's punch barely moved the heavy bag. But when he channeled energy, his fist connected with a thunderous impact that sent the bag flying across the chamber to slam into the wall. Jason stared at his hand in amazement. He'd never been strong before. On the streets, he'd avoided fights because he always lost. Now he felt like he could punch through steel. But Dr. Myra warned him that physical enhancement was just the beginning. True celestial monarch abilities went far beyond simple strength. They could create energy constructs, barriers of solid light that could deflect weapons. They could heal injuries by rewriting the cellular structure of damaged tissue. Advanced practitioners could even manipulate probability, making unlikely events more likely and vice versa. Some of the most powerful celestial monarchs have been able to teleport across vast distances, create stable wormholes, and perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously. Jason's potential was unlimited, but unlocking it would take time they didn't have. 6 days into his training, the Shadow Collective arrived. Their fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the star system, dozens of black ships bristling with weapons. They broadcast another message, final and uncompromising: surrender the false heir or be destroyed. No negotiation, no mercy. The battle begins. The Unity fleet went to battle stations. Defensive shields powered up across all ships. Weapon systems came online, and fighter craft launched from every carrier. Ambassador Theron addressed the entire fleet, his mental voice reaching every being aboard every ship. He stated that the Unity Council existed to protect life and uphold justice. They would not surrender Jason Cole to murderers, and they would defend themselves against aggression.
If the Shadow Collective wanted war, they would find the Unity Council more than capable of providing it. The Shadow Collective's response was to open fire. The void of space lit up with energy weapons and missile trails. Shields flared as they absorbed impacts. A Unity frigate took a direct hit to its port side, armor plating rupturing as atmosphere vitzed into space. Fighter craft engaged in deadly dances, weaving between larger ships while exchanging fire. The Celestial Throne shuddered as enemy weapons struck its shields. Jason felt every impact through the ship's structure. He was in the amplification chamber with Dr. Myra, who had insisted they continue training even during the battle. She believed Jason's abilities might be their best defense. Jason tried to focus on the meditation exercises, but his concentration kept breaking as the ship shook. Then he felt something that made his blood run cold. Through his connection to the energy field, he could sense people dying. Unity Fleet crew members whose life forces suddenly winked out as their ships were destroyed or sections were breached. The deaths felt like hammer blows to his consciousness, each one a unique light extinguished. He gasped and opened his eyes, tears streaming down his face. How many people were dying because of him, because he existed? Dr. Myra saw his distress and understood immediately. She told him gently that these people weren't dying because of him. They were dying because the Shadow Collective had chosen violence over peace. Jason had done nothing wrong. He was innocent, but if he wanted to honor their sacrifice, he needed to learn to defend himself and others. Power unleashed. Something shifted inside Jason at those words. The guilt transformed into determination. He closed his eyes again and reached out through the energy field, extending his awareness far beyond the chamber, beyond the ship. The universal field revealed itself in staggering detail. He could sense every ship in the battle, friend and foe alike. He could feel the energy flowing through their power systems, the weapons charging, the shields weakening under sustained fire. It was overwhelming, an ocean of information threatening to drown his mind. But Jason held on, focusing his will. He reached out to one of the Shadow Collective ships, a cruiser that was hammering a Unity destroyer with concentrated fire. Jason touched the energy threads connected to the cruiser's weapons and pulled. Not gently, but with force born of desperation. The cruiser's weapon systems overloaded in a cascade of feedback. Explosions rippled through its hull as power conduits melted and energy cells ruptured. The ship went dark, drifting helplessly.
Jason moved to the next enemy ship, then the next. His consciousness flowed through the battlefield like wind, touching and disrupting. Weapons failed, shields collapsed, engine cores shut down. Within minutes, half the Shadow Collective fleet was disabled, their crews scrambling to understand what was happening. In the amplification chamber, blood ran from Jason's nose, and his body trembled with the strain. Dr. Myra monitored his vital signs with growing alarm. He was burning through energy at a rate that should kill him, pushing his untrained abilities far beyond safe limits. But Jason couldn't stop. More Unity Fleet personnel were dying with every second that the battle continued. He reached deeper into the universal field, touching energies he didn't understand, and found something incredible. The space between the fleets, the void itself, was made of energy. It could be manipulated just like matter. The impossible made real. Jason focused every ounce of his will on a single impossible act. He touched the fabric of space surrounding the Celestial Throne and its escort ships, found the quantum threads that defined location and distance, and changed them. Reality folded. Space twisted. The Celestial Throne and 20 other Unity ships vanished from their position in a flash of golden light and reappeared thousands of miles away, instantly removed from the battlefield. The Shadow Collective fleet found itself firing at empty space, their tactical systems screaming impossible readings. Ships didn't teleport. It violated every known law of physics, but it had happened. Jason collapsed in the amplification chamber, unconscious before he hit the floor. Dr. Myra rushed to his side as medical alerts blared. His vital signs were erratic, his body temperature dangerously high, and energy readings from his cells showed levels that should have torn him apart. But somehow, impossibly, he was alive.
When Jason woke 3 hours later, he found himself in a medical bed surrounded by monitoring equipment and concerned faces. Ambassador Farron stood at the foot of the bed, his expression mixing relief and awe. The ambassador explained that the battle had ended. The Shadow Collective, faced with an enemy who could disable their ships at will and teleport entire fleets across space, had withdrawn. Their commander had broadcast the message, stating that they would not engage with the Unity Council again, that the cost was too high. More importantly, the footage of what Jason had done had been transmitted across the Galactic network. Every species, every faction now knew that the heir to the Celestial Monarchs was not just a genetic curiosity, but a being of genuine power. Jason asked weakly how many Unity personnel had died. Theron's expression grew somber. 17 ships destroyed, over 3,000 casualties. Each loss was mourned. But without Jason's intervention, the casualties would have been 10 times higher. Jason had saved the fleet. A new beginning. Dr. Myra appeared beside the bed, her scanner showing readings that made her shake her head in amazement. Jason should be dead or permanently damaged from the strain he put on himself. But instead, his body was already healing, his cells reorganizing and strengthening. His unconscious use of the universal field during the crisis had triggered a cascade of genetic activation. Powers that should have taken years to awaken were now accessible. He was growing into his abilities faster than any recorded Celestial Monarch descendant. But she warned him seriously that he needed to be careful. Using that much power again before proper training could kill him. The next days were quieter. The Unity fleet held memorial services for the fallen, and Jason attended every one he could, feeling the weight of each name spoken aloud. These people had died defending him, giving him a chance to survive and grow into his potential. He would never forget them.
Earth, meanwhile, was processing the revelation that one of their own was now a galactic figure. News channels ran nonstop coverage. Scientists debated the implications. World leaders called for Jason to return and represent humanity, while others argued he belonged to all species now, not just Earth. Jason's face was everywhere, from news broadcasts to social media. The homeless man from Neo-Chicago had become the most famous human alive. Jason received a message from his sister, Emma, who he hadn't spoken to in 6 years. She had seen the broadcasts and couldn't believe it was really him. She apologized for losing touch, for giving up on him when he needed help. She asked if he was okay, if any of this was real. Jason recorded a response, telling her that yes, it was real, and yes, he was okay. He forgave her for the past. Holding grudges served no purpose. He promised to visit Earth when he could, to see her and her family. But his path now led beyond their home planet, into a future he was still learning to understand. Embracing destiny, Ambassador Theron came to Jason's quarters one evening with news. The Unity Council had formally recognized him as the heir to the Celestial Monarchy. They were offering him a position on the Council itself, a voice in galactic governance. But more than that, they wanted to establish an institute dedicated to studying and preserving Celestial Monarch knowledge, with Jason as its founder and primary teacher. There might be other descendants out there, scattered across the galaxy, and they would need guidance. Jason accepted without hesitation. He had spent 4 years being invisible, worthless in society's eyes. Now he had a chance to be something more, to help others, to ensure that the sacrifices made to protect him weren't in vain. The institute would be called the Royal Heritage Foundation, and its mission would be to understand the past while building a better future. Construction began immediately on a dedicated station in a peaceful star system. Jason spent his days training with Dr. Myra, learning to control his awakened abilities without burning himself out. He practiced creating energy shields, manipulating matter at a molecular level, and perceiving the deeper layers of the universal field. His progress was extraordinary. Within months, he could do things that took other practitioners decades to achieve. He could heal minor injuries with a touch, create constructs of solid light, and teleport small objects across a room. He was also learning to lead. Representatives from dozens of species came to meet him, and Jason found himself in diplomatic discussions about trade, territory, and alliance. His unique perspective, having been at the bottom of society and now elevated to its heights,
gave him insights that bridged divides. He understood suffering and hope in ways that wealthy, powerful beings never could. The legacy continues. 1 year after the scanner had beeped and changed his life forever, Jason stood in the central hall of the Royal Heritage Foundation. The station was complete, a beautiful structure of crystal and metal that housed laboratories, training facilities, libraries, and living quarters for hundreds of residents. Scientists from across the galaxy had come to study celestial monarch technology and genetics. Students arrived to learn about the universal field and how to sense and work with its energies. And Jason was at the center of it all. No longer a homeless man, but a teacher, leader, and symbol of hope. Dr. Myra found him standing before a large viewport, gazing out at the stars. She stood beside him in comfortable silence for a moment before speaking. She told him how proud she was of how far he'd come, how he'd grown from a frightened man who didn't believe in himself into someone who inspired others. Jason smiled and admitted he still sometimes couldn't believe any of this was real. He dreamed sometimes that he was back in the alley, cold and hungry, and this was all just a fantasy his mind had created to escape the misery. But then he would wake up in his comfortable quarters, surrounded by friends and purpose, and know it was real. Dr. Myra asked him if he ever regretted accepting Theron's offer, if he ever wished he could return to a simpler life. Jason thought about it carefully before answering. He said there were things he missed about Earth, about being human in the ordinary sense. But he wouldn't go back. Too many people depended on him now. He had responsibilities, opportunities to make a real difference in the galaxy. And more than that, he had finally found where he belonged.
News came through the communication systems that Earth had made formal contact with 3 other species, establishing trade agreements and cultural exchanges. Humanity was taking its first real steps into the galactic community, and they were doing well. Jason felt pride in his species, in the adaptability and curiosity that had allowed them to thrive. He also received regular messages from Emma and her children. His niece and nephew loved hearing stories about aliens and space stations. Emma had gotten a better job and moved to a nicer neighborhood. Things were looking up for his family, and knowing they were okay gave Jason peace. The Shadow Collective had fragmented after their defeat, many of its members recognizing that violence against the Unity Council was futile. Some former members even reached out to Jason, apologizing for their actions, and asking to learn about the Celestial Monarch's true history rather than the propaganda they've been fed. Full circle. 5 years after his discovery, Jason returned to Earth for the first time since leaving. A Unity shuttle brought him to Neo Chicago, landing in a park near the downtown area. A crowd had gathered, thousands of people wanting to see the homeless man who had become a legend. Security personnel kept them at a safe distance, but Jason could feel their excitement and curiosity through the energy field. He walked through the city, escorted by Ambassador Theron and a small security detail. The streets had changed in 5 years. New buildings, new businesses, new energy from Earth's integration into the galactic community. But some things remained the same. Jason found the alley where he'd lived for 4 years. The cardboard box was long gone, but the walls still bore the same graffiti, the same stains. He stood there for a long moment, remembering the cold nights, the hunger, the despair. A young homeless man approached cautiously, recognizing Jason from the news broadcasts, but hardly daring to believe it was really him. Jason smiled and introduced himself, shaking the young man's hand. They talked for a while, and Jason learned his story. Job loss, medical debt, family problems, the same downward spiral that had claimed Jason years ago. Before leaving, Jason pressed something into the young man's hand. It was a credit chip, loaded with enough money to get him back on his feet, plus contact information for services that could help. He told the young man that being homeless didn't mean being worthless, that everyone deserved a second chance. The young man stared at the chip with tears in his eyes, stammering his thanks. Jason told him to pay it forward someday, to help someone else when he was able. As Jason walked away from the alley for the last time, Ambassador Theron commented that he'd noticed Jason always returned to help the homeless wherever they traveled. The ambassador wondered why Jason focused so much energy on that particular issue when there were so many needs across the galaxy. Jason's answer was simple but profound.
He said that society judged people by their wealth, status, and success. The homeless were invisible, treated as less than human, their suffering ignored. But every one of them was a person with dignity and worth. He had been one of them, knew what it felt like to be discarded. If he could use his position and resources to remind the galaxy that every being mattered, regardless of their circumstances, then his power had meaning beyond just genetic inheritance. The future unfolds. The visit to Earth continued for a week. Jason spoke at universities, met with world leaders, and visited Emma and her family. His niece and nephew were teenagers now, bright and curious. They asked him endless questions about space, aliens, and his abilities. Jason showed them small demonstrations, making objects float and creating shapes out of light. Their wonder reminded him of why he'd accepted this path, why he'd chosen to embrace his heritage rather than run from it. When it was time to leave Earth again, Jason stood on the shuttle platform and looked back at his home planet. He loved Earth, loved humanity with all their flaws and potential. But his destiny lay beyond that blue sphere, out in the vast galaxy where ancient powers stirred and new challenges waited.
Back at the Royal Heritage Foundation, work continued on deciphering more celestial monarch technology and knowledge. Every discovery brought new possibilities and new questions. Jason spent his days teaching students from hundreds of species, helping them understand the universal field and their own potential. Some had genetic markers of other ancient species, lesser than the celestial monarchs, but still significant. Others were simply talented individuals with natural sensitivity to energy. All of them looked to Jason for guidance, and he gave it gladly, remembering how Dr. Myra had patiently taught him when he knew nothing. One of Jason's proudest achievements was establishing scholarship programs for the disadvantaged across the galaxy. Students from poor worlds, from species that had been oppressed or overlooked, were given opportunities to study at the Foundation regardless of their ability to pay. Jason funded these programs personally, from the stipend the Unity Council provided him. He wanted to ensure that no one's potential was wasted because of circumstances beyond their control. Dr. Myra often joked that Jason was building an army of grateful trained individuals who would change the galaxy. Jason would smile and say that was exactly the point. The beggar who became royalty. 10 years after the scanner beeped, Jason stood before the Unity Council as they voted to formally restore the celestial monarchy as a symbolic position within galactic governance. He would serve as the first celestial monarch in 3 million years, not as a ruler with absolute power, but as a voice for justice, compassion, and the protection of all beings. The title came with responsibilities, but also with resources to do even more good. Jason accepted the position with humility, remembering the man he'd been a decade ago. The coronation ceremony was attended by representatives from every member species of the Unity Council. Jason wore robes made of fabric that seemed to capture starlight, a crown of crystallized energy that floated above his head, and carried a staff that was actually an ancient celestial monarch artifact, a tool for channeling and focusing the universal field. When he spoke to the assembled delegates, Jason's words were broadcast across the galaxy. He talked about his journey from the streets of Mio Chicago to the celestial throne. He spoke of the people who had died defending him, whose sacrifice he would never forget. He promised to use his position and abilities to serve all beings, especially those without power or voice. He declared that the new celestial monarchy would stand for compassion, justice, and the inherent worth of every living being. The delegates rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Even species that had initially opposed the restoration of the monarchy found themselves moved by Jason's sincerity and vision. That evening, Jason stood alone in his quarters, looking at his reflection in a mirror. The face that looked back was still his own, but changed. Older, more confident, marked by experiences he never could have imagined. He fought about a beggar who had huddled in a cardboard box, invisible to the passing crowds. That man still lived inside him, a part of his soul that would never forget what it meant to be powerless and forgotten. But now that man had become something extraordinary, not through his own seeking, but through the chance beeping of a scanner.
Jason smiled at his reflection and made a silent promise. He would never become so elevated that he forgot where he came from. He would use every resource, every ability, every privilege of his position to lift up others. This homeless man had become royalty, but the beggar's heart would always beat within the monarch's chest. And perhaps that was exactly what the galaxy needed. A ruler who understood suffering, who had known what it meant to be last and least, and who would ensure that no being was ever truly invisible again. The stars shone outside his window, infinite and beautiful, and Jason knew his journey was far from over. There were more descendants to find, more mysteries to unlock, more lives to touch and change. The scanner had beeped, and in that moment, everything had changed. Not just for Jason Cole, but for an entire galaxy that was rediscovering hope, compassion, and the truth that greatness could come from the most unexpected places. The beggar had become royalty, and in doing so, had reminded the universe that every being, no matter how low they had fallen, carried within them the potential for extraordinary transformation.